All right, we're now in Algebra 2, the first unit, Unit 1, which is Chapters 1 and 2 put together. We're on Lesson 1.4, which is all about solving absolute value equations. So our key terms, absolute value is just a number's distance from 0, so it's always positive. You'll notice we denote or we mark it as these two bars right here. So this would be the absolute value of x. So we could also write something like, put the bars absolute value of -5. Okay, this would equal then 5, because -5 is 5 spaces away from 0. So the absolute value basically just means always make it positive. If this was already positive, so just regular 5, it would still be 5. So absolute value just means make whatever's inside of here positive. The empty set then is our next key term. It just means no solution, and you can write it as a big circle with a slash through it, or use this set notation, so these squiggly brackets with nothing on the inside. So it means there's nothing that will make it true, or there's no solution. So let's go on to absolute value expressions. So for our first example, we're going to evaluate an expression with an absolute value. Now when you see this word evaluate, right here, evaluate, you should be thinking plug in or solve. Anytime you're evaluating or solving, you're just plugging in this x value right here. So if x was 4, and we are evaluating 2.7 plus absolute value of 6 minus 2x, we're just replacing all of these x's with 4. So it looks something like this. Here where I saw an x, I just plugged in 4. So now it's 2.7 plus the absolute value of 6 minus 2 times 4. 2 times 4 is, of course, 8. So now we're going on to doing inside this absolute value. It's kind of like a parenthesis, so we want to do it first before we do anything on the outside. 6 minus 8 is actually -2. So now it's 2.7 plus the absolute value of -2. Well, the absolute value of -2 is +2, or just 2. So 2.7 plus 2 will give us our final answer of 4.7. That would be how to evaluate an expression with an absolute value. Just plug it in, and that absolute value means solve everything inside first and make it positive. All right, let's go on to our second part then. We're doing absolute value equations. Okay, we're going to do 3 different examples of this. On all of them, first thing I want you to think about is getting the absolute value piece alone. Notice that I put the bars around the word absolute value. That's the piece you're trying to get alone. Once you can get that absolute value alone, then you can break it into 2 equations, and I'll show you what I mean with this example. So we have this example, solve the absolute value of y plus 3 is equal to 8. So what we're thinking is, inside this absolute value, if it's equal to 8, that means inside here can either be one of 2 things. It can be an 8, because the absolute value of 8 is 8, or it can be a -8, because the absolute value of -8 is also 8. So notice, 2 different answers that would give us 8. Now this makes sense because we have our absolute value piece alone. So as long as the absolute value piece is alone, then you're starting to think, all right, I need to break it into 2 different equations. One that just kept everything regular. We basically just got rid of those absolute value bars. One where the other side, not the absolute value piece, the other side is the opposite. So where it was a +8, it's now a -8. So these are our 2 possible solutions for this equation. Either y plus 3 is equal to a +8, or y plus 3 is equal to a -8. So this 8, the positive one right here, this -8 right here. In either case though, so if we have y plus 3 is equal to 8, subtract 3 from both sides. Same thing here, we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. 8 minus 3 would become 5. Negative 8 minus 3 would become a negative 11. So at this point, we need to check our answers just to make sure they make sense. If we plugged in this 5 right here, we would have 5 plus, let's write in the 8 already. 5 plus 3, which equals 8. And the absolute value of 8 is 8, so this one works out. Same thing, we'll check negative 11 plus 3 is equal to negative 8. Now negative 8, if we put it in here, the absolute value of negative 8 is just positive 8. So this one works out as well. So in the end, we would write our answer as y is equal to 5 or negative 11. Again, make sure that you check those. Plug them back in, check to make sure that it actually does work. Sometimes it won't, and I'll show you an example of that. So that's very important to always check your answer. Our next example shows one situation where you won't have an answer. So it won't work out if you were to check it. Now, before even going through and solving it all, sometimes you can find out, oh, we don't have to solve this one. So like usual, first step is to get the absolute value piece alone. Okay? Once you have the absolute value piece all alone, check to see if it makes sense. If you have an absolute value equaling a negative number, well, absolute values are always positive. So if it equals negative, it doesn't make sense. So if we have absolute value of 6 minus 4t, all of that plus 5 equals 0, well, we want to get our absolute value piece alone. So we're going to minus 5 from both sides of this equation, in which case we now have the absolute value of 6 minus 4t equals negative 5. Now again, at this point, that doesn't make sense because an absolute value can't be negative. So you could go through and solve this just like we did up here. You would plug in your answers to check it, and in the end it would not work out. So you would find out for both of them it doesn't work. Or you can just notice right here, absolute value cannot equal a negative. So you would say your answer is either the empty set, this 0 with a slash through it, or you can just say no solution. Any of these three is a correct way to say it doesn't work out. There's no possible value for t that we could plug in that would make this equation true. Sometimes as you work through, you'll find that only one of your solutions works. So again, like usual, you always start by getting the absolute value piece all alone. Then you'll break it into two equations, one regular and one where everything is opposite. So for this example, we have the absolute value of 8 plus y is equal to 2y minus 3. So notice that the absolute value piece is already alone. So we've already got that done for us. Now we'll break it into two different equations, one where everything was regular, one where it's opposite. Now I'm showing you here how the opposite piece works. It's this whole thing, the 2y minus 3, that is opposite, or it's negative. So I put a negative on the outside. Remember, that's kind of like saying negative 1 times each of these pieces. It's being distributed to each of those. So negative 1 times 2y, negative 2y. Negative 1 times this minus 3, or a negative 3, becomes a positive 3. So this here is what it should look like. 8 plus y equals negative 2y plus 3. This is how you correctly make the opposite, or the other side, turn opposite. Okay? Now from here, we just work towards solving each of these equations separately. So for this one, if we're trying to get y alone, maybe we would add 3 to both sides, in which case it's now 11 plus y equals 2y. And I'm even just going to put a little 1 right here, because it's like 1y here. So now we subtract 1y from both sides, here and here, and we would get 11 equals 1y, or just y. Now we're going to have to check that one, but before we do, I'm going to go over and solve the other side. So from this one, we have 8 plus y equals negative 2y plus 3. So let's say maybe we add 2y to both sides. Remember, with nothing in front of it, it's like there's a 1 here. So that one is going to become, 3y. 8 plus 3y equals 3. And we'll get rid of our extra 8 here by subtracting 8 on both sides. So 3y left over here equals negative 5. 3 minus 8 is negative 5. And the last thing we'll have to do is divide everything by 3. And we get y equals negative 5 thirds. We'll have to check that as well. So first let's try checking y equals 11. 8 plus 11 is 19. Absolute value of 19 is just 19. 2 times 11 is 22. Minus 3 is 19. So this one checks out. Okay, if we're looking at negative 5 thirds, if we plug it into this side, 2 times negative 5 thirds would be negative 10 thirds, minus 3. Well, if you have a negative, you're subtracting, you're going further negative. Okay, that would actually become negative 19 thirds. And this side is now a negative. It doesn't make sense to have an absolute value equal a negative. So without even plugging it in here and solving out the absolute value, you could, but it wouldn't equal out to a negative 19 thirds in the end. So we'd know that this one does not work. So even though we solved it over here, it was very important that we checked this, because it turned out this one did not work. So in the end, y equals 11 was our only possible solution. And that'll wrap it up for our first lesson.